Greece and Turkey have been embroiled in a long-standing dispute over maritime borders. Tensions have escalated since summer 2020, when Turkey actively embarked on searching for oil and gas in maritime zones, not yet delimited between the two states. Successive military exercises in the Mediterranean and the Aegean Seas have contributed to sustaining the tension in the region. Dialogue between the two states has not led to a positive outcome yet.
How are the Greek-Turkish disputes perceived in Greece and in Turkey respectively? Mr. Tsakonas?
Well, Turkey, particularly the so-called threat from the east, has been, still is, and I'm afraid will remain Greece's central security concern and the main factor underpinning its foreign and security policies and initiatives. For Greek decision makers, the most prominent issue in the bilateral agenda seems to be the delimitation of the continental south and the Aegean. However, over the last decade, and especially over the last 3 years, it seems that there has been a geographical broadening, I would say, of the bilateral dispute beyond the Aegean Sea towards the Mediterranean, which by implication led to the two states started talking about the delimitation of their exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean, and this seems to be the new feature in the Greek-Turkish conflict agenda. Moreover, what is of particular concern to Greece's decision makers, particularly over the last 3 years or so, is that Turkey is not hesitant in coupling, I would say, the deployment of hard power means and tactics in the Eastern Mediterranean and to a certain extent over the Greek-Turkish borders in Evros, with an inflammatory rhetoric against Greece, along with the fiercely national narrative of Mavi Vatan, the blue homeland.
Mr. Aydin?
Well, looking from Turkey's perspective, with its several areas of connection, being in the middle of sub-regions of the world where you have several different types of conflicts, I would say that Greece is not at the top of the agenda of Turkish foreign policy or even the security policy. I used to say that Greece was on the second page of the list of Turkey's problems, which is quite true, but at times, of course, it comes to the first page and sometimes at the top of the agenda. At those times, of course, we see flaring up of conflicts or tension, at least, between Greece and Turkey. Looking from Turkish perspective, I would say the most important issue or dispute is the territorial waters. For Turkey, continental shelf flows out of the territorial waters. And that's why the possibility of extension of Greek territorial waters is considered as casus belli, the reason for war in Turkey, and it's already mentioned. But apart from that, all the other issues that two countries have been experiencing are kind of seen as a whole in Turkey. When you have one problem in one area, then other issues also creep in. As an example or justification that the other side, in this case Greece, is always wrong and it's always problematic, it's always provocative to Turkey. And that's the main narrative in Turkey, that Greece has been more provocative in the relationship and Turkey wishes to have more stable relationship. Widening the dispute to the Eastern Mediterranean, in that sense, reinforces this perception.
What is the impact of the Cyprus problem on the Greek-Turkish disputes, and how does it affect Greek-Turkish relations? Should Greece or Cyprus opt for disentangling their disputes from the Cyprus problem? Mr. Aydin?
Well, it has been very disruptive for bilateral relations. In Turkey, and as far as I know in Greece also, it was considered as what I would call national issue. So an issue that it's very difficult to compromise. And of course, it doesn't help that we have not only two parties to this dispute, but we have at least 4 parties, and plus international attention and involvement. So that always complicates the issue. Whether we could entangle Cyprus from the totality of Greek-Turkish relations, I have my doubt. Both governments actually tried in the past to disentangle it and try to consider it as a separate issue or separate problem. This is not possible for 2 reasons, I think. One is the European dimension, EU dimension. Cyprus Republic being the member of the European Union makes it a very complicated issue for Turkey. Any kind of issue that you are talking or discussing with the European Union or with Greece becomes part of a discussion between the Republic of Cyprus and Turkey in a roundabout way, because there is no direct recognition and direct negotiations. But it blocks the way forward. The second aspect, why it's difficult to disentangle, what I would call psychological aspect of the relationship between Turkey and Greece. Because in both countries, it seems that the decision makers are very careful of not to be seen as giving in on one area of dispute. That also prevents the solution of most of the problems, because they think that if they compromise on one issue, that might effectively spill over into the other issues, then you become a country that is compromising most. So that kind of creates a very delicate and impossible balance with the Cyprus issue and all the other issues in bilateral relations. And that's why I think it's almost impossible to entangle. We have to take it a holistic view and kind of a holistic negotiation in all these issues.
Mr. Tsakonas?
Well, I have a bit different view on this. To start with, I would use a metaphor to describe the huge impact of the Cyprus problem on the Greek-Turkish conflict. I would compare the Greek-Turkish conflict with a pendulum, with the Cyprus problem being the gravity force of this pendulum, which moves it. It renews the confrontation, and to a certain extent it prevents it from being resolved. Many analysts in Greece and I think in Turkey as well have argued so far that had the Cyprus problem been resolved, it would highlight the technical, let's say, issues or the technical nature of the Greek-Turkish conflict in the Aegean, making thus its resolution more feasible. Also, let's not forget that the Cyprus issue appears responsible for this geographical broadening of the bilateral dispute beyond the Aegean Sea. However, on the disentanglement issue or decoupling issue, as we call it, of the Greek-Turkish dispute from the Cyprus problem, I would say that this decoupling has already taken place. It's already a reality in relations between Athens and Nicosia. And it is indeed this decoupling that has given Greece free rein to engage in a dialogue with Turkey in January of this year, of the so-called exploratory talks, as we call them. Interestingly enough, these talks have taken place, have resumed regardless of any progress made towards a resolution of the Cyprus problem, and only on the condition that Turkey abstains from unilateral actions and provocations vis-à-vis Greece, not Cyprus, in the Eastern Mediterranean.
What is the current state of play, and what is the best one should expect out of the current situation? Mr. Tsakonas?
Well, Greek-Turkish relations, as you probably know, have started being deteriorated already since the 2000s, the mid-2000s, especially when Turkey's European path or orientation has been negated. Relations go much worse and got much worse after the presidential elections in Turkey in 2018, after the adoption by the so-called New Turkey of certain actions to disputed waters in the Eastern Mediterranean, which had in turn led to severe tensions between with Greece and Cyprus. Therefore, the prospects for a resolution of the conflict are today dim, to say the least. So the best Greece can expect out of the current situation with regard to its relations with Turkey, I would say, is crisis stability and normalization of bilateral relations. So, in other words, as things stand now, and waiting for a return on the part of Erdogan, of President Erdogan, to a less confrontational policy or stance vis-à-vis Greece or foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean, the only way forward, to my mind, for Greece is to keep on seeking to balance Turkey, both internally, meaning by strengthening its defense capabilities, and externally, by investing in bilateral relations, partnerships, and strategic alliances with certain states in the region, like Israel or Egypt, as well as certain pro-Western Arab states like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. Aydin?
Greek and Turkish relations have passed through the most tensions period in last summer since, I would say, Kardak-Imia crisis, where the two countries almost went to war. So that was a very difficult period during the last summer up until last few months. My expectation now is continuation of this current tension, no tension situation, and the best outcome could be now, at least for the short to mid-term, is continuation of crisis management mode that the two countries and number of their partners in international relations are engaged in. In this environment, also, two countries could, and I think they are trying to do it, to revival of building a bilateral positive agenda, which might take two countries back to the, I would say, to quiet diplomacy period of the previous years. That's the most we can expect at the moment. Towards the solution, striving towards the solution is quite difficult and impossible at this moment. Regarding the current strategies of both countries, We have to accept and assume that any move from any one of them, either Turkey or Greece, creates a reaction on the other side. So the recent Greek attempts of trying to balance Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean especially would no doubt create a reactive move from Turkey. And that's, for me, is a classical conflict cycle and classical armament cycle, which is very dangerous. So that's something that we should be striving and hoping to put a stop and give a positive turn to diplomacy again.
What kind of strategies should be devised by Greece and Turkey towards the resolution of their long-standing conflict? Mr. Aydin?
Well, first of all, I think both countries should be ready for a groundbreaking compromises. This has never happened on the both sides of the Aegean. As the things stands currently, we all know all the problems between Greece and Turkey, and we all know all the details of all these problems, and we almost all know the proposals of both countries how to solve all these problems. The sticking point is to make a compromise, which is seen in both sides as some sort of an unpatriotic or less patriotic move. So that's the first thing that we have to accept. The politicians, the leaders of both countries should be ready for a compromise and should be ready to take the political cost of these compromises. That's the first thing. The second is, I think both countries need to push for, or at least need to encourage people-to-people connections even further. That helped in the past 10, 15 years to furthering the relations, but it's not enough. The last crisis in the last summer have shown that this was not enough. It was broken down. Pandemic did not help. The connections were lessened, but we need to push further cooperation, further partnerships, further people-to-people understandings of each other, which kind of de-demonize the relationship and the other side. And finally, the governments on both sides need to push for deepening and widening of the relationship, just like the European Union. You deepen and you widen the bilateral connections and bilateral partnerships into new areas all the time and push further for more cooperation, so that at one point you might not be able to disentangle, so that you have to learn to live together. Not only learn to live with the conflicts together, but to learn to live together peacefully. I know this is a long-term prospect, but there is no short, fixable, easy solution to the Greek-Turkish relations, which has been going on at least, let's say, last 50 years, but it has a long, long history also.
Professor Tsakonas?
Let me start from this point. There have indeed been real possibilities for the resolution of the Greek-Turkish conflict. About 20 years ago, when Greece emerged as a supporter of Turkey's EU membership ambitions and also granted Turkey EU candidacy status at the December 1999 European Council at Helsinki. Yet, although the Helsinki decisions heralded an era of a comprehensive political and economic reform in Turkey, and in 2004 Cyprus joined the European Union, neither the Cyprus problem has been solved, nor the Greek-Turkish dispute in the Aegean were referred to the International Court of Justice. So the favorable conditions for a resolution, for conflict resolution, have thus dissipated, and the prospects, as I have already mentioned, for a resolution of the conflict are today dim. However, and in order to end with on a positive note, I would say, I still see a window of opportunity for Greece to devise a strategy that could lead to the resolution of its dispute, as well as of Cyprus's dispute with Turkey, especially over the delimitation of their exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean. Greece should, in my mind, be an active supporter and an agenda setter, if possible, of the multilateral conference in the Eastern Mediterranean, which has been proposed by the President of the EU Council about a year ago. So this conference aims to have the key parties of the Eastern Mediterranean states on board, along with the European Union and possibly NATO, in order for the most, I would say, crucial security issue in the Eastern Mediterranean, which has to do with the maritime boundaries, the limitation of the maritime boundaries, to be resolved in accordance, and that's important, with the provisions of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.